Why do you care about some study we conducted more than 30 standard years ago? Krevchak sneered at the reporter that had come knocking at his door, almost yelling at him to be heard over the storm that raged outside. Equal parts of bewilderment and admiration hid beneath the sneering words, however. Tracking Krevchak down was no small feat, after all. He had set up his homestead on the most remote moon he could find in the Skildari Ascendancy's frontier systems. A handful of farming families and an automated protein plant were his only neighbors in the entirety of the stellar body. He had liquidated all of his assets to relocate there from his original home in the Skildari capital world, precisely because he didn't want to be found. To be greeted by a soaking wet journalist, asking him about the very project that had prompted his abrupt relocation 3 standard decades ago, both confused and impressed him.
Well, sir, given the current political climate in the galaxy, every piece of information we can gather on the Terrans is invaluable. The treatise on the Terran food chain, the study you were the head of 30 years ago, is one of the most comprehensive sources of knowledge we have on their social and biological evolution. It has been cited countless times by other academics, and excerpts from it have made it in the broadcasts of all the major intersystems news networks, the reporter answered in an almost rehearsed manner.
I don't get news networks out here, Krevchak interrupted. I have no idea of the political situation in the galaxy, and I have no interest in learning about it either. He began to close the door on the reporter's face.
Sir, please,
the journalist said, shoving himself in the gap of the door, preventing it from shutting completely.
The Imperium is on the warpath against the Federation. Their strike forces are amassing. Their astral legions are being mobilized. The last time we saw such activity from them, the Dothraki Commonwealth was almost annihilated. Those that weren't slaughtered by the Imperium filled refugee camps across the Federation for decades before it was safe for them to be relocated again. An interview with you would help shed some light on the current situation, help us understand, help the rest of the galaxy too.
Help? Krevchak asked back. If you had understood my study, you would know that there is no help. If you were smart, you would find a remote world on the edge of the Skildari periphery until the end of your days, hoping not to be discovered, like I have.
That's why talking to you is so important. The Imperium of Terra is a foe we do not understand, a foe that the High Council doesn't understand either. Please, it will only be a moment of your time, then I will never bother you again, the reporter pleaded.
Krevchak considered pushing the door on the reporter before finally relenting. With a sigh, he opened the door fully and gestured for him to walk in. Krevchak's living quarters were noticeably stark. The structure itself was prefabricated and modular, the kind that are normally set up temporarily on new homesteads before a proper building is erected. The elements had taken their toll on it too. Streaks of rust flowed across its walls, and signs of corrosion were evident. In other places, the walls seemed to have been patched again and again in an attempt to cover holes. The inside was bereft of all but the most basic amenities: a rudimentary eating area, a kitchen, a space heater that used organic fuel, a bathroom, and a bed. Small wood carvings, strewn across the shelves and counters, acted as decoration. The stench of stagnancy permeated the space. The only place in the living quarters that seemed livable was a tiny reading and writing corner. It consisted of a makeshift library that hugged the entire corner, created from logs and tree branches that were sawed in half, filled to the brim with books of parchment, digislates, and a plethora of trinkets. There was also a small table that was obviously crafted by an amateur carpenter, a chair of similar craftsmanship, several stacks of digislates, and a mess of handwritten notes that laid over the table and spilled onto the floor. I spend most of my time outdoors, Krevchak said preemptively. A slight hint of embarrassment about his living situation broke through his voice. I have a crosslander with a living space in it, and a small Atmo craft that I use to go on field trips. I gather samples and notes and send them to a colleague back on Maker's Cradle for cataloging.
The same catalog that I'm assuming disclosed my location to you in spite of my wishes for solitude. He understood the importance of interviewing you, sir.
The reporter tried to excuse their mutual acquaintance.
This moon exhibits some impressive biodiversity.
Krevchak ignored the reporter's interjection.
I have discovered more species of fauna and flora in my 30 years here than everything that has been discovered on Maker's Cradle since the dawn of our civilization. And yet, it's nothing compared to what once was on Terra.
The reporter looked around for a place to sit, hesitant to use the only chair in the room. Eventually, he settled for standing next to the heater, while Krevchak rummaged through his kitchen's cabinets, searching for something.
Excuse the lack of sitting. I don't often have visitors. Though you said you would only be here for a moment, so I don't suppose you'll mind standing up,
Krevchak said, finally producing a small pouch from one of the cabinets and pouring its contents in a small kettle filled with brownish water.
I have some questions I would like to ask you,
the reporter said as he switched on the recorder attached to his wrist.
No, you don't, Krevchak interjected. You think you have some questions based on your rudimentary understanding of my study, and on the comments other researchers, equally as ignorant as you are, have made on the news networks you work for. You'll just waste both of our times, so I'm going to spare both of us and skip them if you don't mind.
The reporter nodded silently as he was handed a stained cup filled with a strong-smelling concoction inside it.
It's a stimulant, brewed from a local plant. It's similar in molecular structure to a Terran plant with similar properties called coffee. Drink it. I've found it makes conversations more pleasant,
Krevchak explained.
Thank you,
the reporter answered with apprehension. Krevchak swept away a handful of notes written on yellow parchment from the small table and set down his own cup before sitting in the chair.
First things first. My name and title are Commander Tirith Krevchak. I was, and still am, an officer of the Skildarian Void Navy, with 13 Void battles under me. I fought alongside the Imperium of Terra during the Malkir Containment War, 50 standard years ago, when the Federation counted them as allies. I have seen how they fight. I have witnessed their tactics in action. I know what they are capable of. I am also a doctor of xenobiology, with a focus on sentient evolution. On that basis, I was given command of Project Hindsight.
You never mention your study as being a part of a Navy project.
That's because the project was classified, as was about 70% of the study's findings. What was released to the public was edited and censored to hell and back. That's how I know that what's being reported by your news networks is drivel. Incomplete drivel, only loosely based on what we really found.
I had no idea. Why are you telling this to me now? Aren't you afraid you'll be court-martialed? The reporter asked.
If what you're saying is true, and the Imperium has decided to make enemies out of us, then it doesn't matter. None of this matters, Krevchak answered with grim certainty. Project Hindsight was authorized shortly after the Malkir Containment War, and its purpose was the study of the Terran biosphere that led to the evolution and eventual dominance of the Terrans upon their homeworld. This is something the Skildari Ascendancy has done before, when meeting with a new species of sentience that shows promise or signs of being a threat. The aim is to understand what truly makes them tick, and to do that, you need a solid grasp of their evolutionary trajectory, the evolutionary forces and conditions of their homeworld that led to them being the way they were.
But the Terran biosphere had collapsed for over 1,000 standard years at that point. Native flora and fauna had been extinct for a long time by the time of the Malkir containment, the reporter said.
That's true. That's why we were looking further back, Krevchak explained. The Terran biosphere indeed collapsed during the First Contact War with the Ixatar, when the Terrans scorched the surface of their own world in nuclear fire, in an attempt to deny it from the invaders.
Krevchak chuckled at the thought of what the Terrans had done, what they were willing to do.
Their tactic worked. They saturated their own atmosphere with so much radiation that anything above the deep shelters of concrete and steel the Terrans had dug for themselves perished. Everything electronic fried as it entered old Earth's atmo, and everything organic had its flesh melt off the bone as the radiation destroyed its DNA molecule by molecule. But it worked. When the Ixatar invasion fleet arrived on Terra's orbit, all they could do was blindly drop dumb ordnance on an already dead world, until the Terrans were ready to fight back on their own terms.
"They scorched their own planet?" the reporter asked, dumbfounded.
"Of all the things they have done, this isn't even the most extreme. That's why Project Hindsight was imperative. No other sentient species in the galaxy would be willing to do what the Terrans did. No other sentient would be willing to go to such lengths for survival, for victory."
Krevchak opened a drawer from beneath his table, and after a few moments of searching, pulled out an old digislate that, miraculously, still had enough battery to turn on.
"As we were saying, the Terran biosphere had completely collapsed by the time of the Malkir Containment War, so what we had to do was look back in time, to when there was still a biosphere to examine."
Krevchak slid the digislate to the reporter. On it was the schematic of a mirror. It was built out of ultra-durable and highly reflective alloys meant for use in the void over an extended period of time. On the schematic, the reporter could recognize thrusters, stabilization retros, and scribbling of a circumference that was equal to that of a small moon.
"We built 572 of these. They formed a chain of reflections that led all the way to Terra. Light bounced off of each mirror, eventually traversing a distance of 80 million light-years at its longest configuration, and 3,000 light-years at its shortest. 3,000 light-years was the closest we could set up our observation post without being detected by the Terrans. You can only see something when the light that bounces from it arrives in your eyes. For example, there's a few tiny fractions of a second that light takes to travel from you to me. Technically, I don't see the real-time you, but the you from a few fractions of a second ago, because that's how long it took for the light to bounce off of you and into my eyes. Our little setup allowed us to have a complete history of Terra from 80 million to 3,000 years ago."
Krevchak swept through what looked like a series of satellite photos on the digislate. Given that those photos were taken from a distance of at least 3,000 light-years away, their quality was nothing less than spectacular. The pictures were clear enough to distinguish between different leaves on a Terran tree. The subject of the photos weren't Terran military installations, manufacturing plants, or even agricultural sites, like one would expect from a military-led project. They were of animals. Each photo showcased a different animal. Some were similar to each other, others were completely distinct. From lumbering behemoths that crushed the earth at their every step, armored by thick scales and armed with tusks and horns capable of eviscerating anything in their path, to elegant avian species with membrane that soared through the skies. There were even pictures of enormous aquatic animals that breached Terra's prehistoric oceans.
"These were all taken from the longest configuration of the mirrors, 80 million years ago in old Earth's past, all of them belonging in the same evolutionary era. Do you notice anything?"
The reporter was stunned.
"So many different species. There are more variants of avians than there are species on Maker's Cradle. How is this possible?" "Extreme biodiversity. Whereas in our case, only a handful of distinct species managed to evolve over a period of billions of years, on Terra, tens of thousands of different species reached evolutionary distinction in a matter of only a few thousands of years. And that's only accounting for the species that were large enough to be picked up by our observation array. We estimate that there possibly were millions of other smaller forms of life that we simply couldn't capture. We speculate that the primordial genome shared by all creatures born on Terra The genome that is the progenitor of every creature that ever wailed on that world was particularly unstable. The genome was prone to rapid mutations, faster and more diverse than anything else encountered in the galaxy. That number of mutations, that amount of biodiversity, it's only natural that it leads to competition. Too many variations of life and limited resources. Not everyone gets to make it. Only the fittest, the most adaptable get to survive. Only they get to pass their DNA down the chain of evolution.
Kevchak scrolled through more of the pictures, and the reporter's fascination slowly turned to horror and disgust at what he saw. Scenes of predation, photos of beasts savaging their prey with claw and fang, tearing at each other's throats, pulling out muscle and sinew at every bite, bathing in their victims' arterial spray. He saw the hunters consuming the flesh of the fallen with ravenous glee. Other photos depicted the prey taking revenge on its predators. Would-be hunters gutted on the end of sharp horns, left to convulse and bleed to death as their prey continued to graze on the flora beside them. The reporter had heard of such things, though as far as he was concerned, they were only rumors. He had heard stories, told by Skildari veterans drunk off of whatever the local dive of some backwater meteor mining station was serving. Stories of Terran legionnaires removing the helmets of their exosuits to attack their enemies with their bare teeth. Stories of Terrans pulling apart their opponents with just their hands. He always assumed they were lies, fabricated by the drunk, the traumatized, and the bored, to gather an audience around them. To actually see that it was possible, though. To see that there were species in the galaxy that fought with such brutality.
This, Kevchak said, this is the basis of Terran evolution.
The killing, the reporter replied. The hunting.
Most star civilizations don't even develop a word for the act of hunting until they reach their agricultural era, where they usually need to chase away pack herbivores from eating their crops. One of the first drawings ever made by the Terrans, using charcoal and calcite on rocks, is a depiction of a hunt.
Kevchak took a sip from his drink, leaning back on his chair.
This is what we are up against. Our food chain has only 4 links. Starlight that fuels the flora, flora that feeds the fauna, and the recyclers that digest and regurgitate dead organic matter. Same goes for the food chain of every other star civilization we have ever made contact with. It allowed us to evolve in harmony with the rest of the life in our homeworlds. It formed the basis of our culture, our beliefs, our collective psyche. When it comes to the Terrans, on the other hand, their food chain is link after link after link of predator and prey, until at the top stands a single apex, a predator of predators, the product of brutality and cruelty carried out across millions of years, designed not to live in harmony, but to crush, designed to dominate. At least 80 million years of evolution selecting for the most efficient predator and for the most resilient prey. At least 80 million years of a biological arms race dedicated to producing the deadliest variation of beast. Tell me, how can we measure up to that?
The reporter stood in quiet. Only the faint crackling of his recorder's microphone broke the silence as it picked up static.
Do yourself a favor, reporter. Don't go back to Maker's Cradle. Start a home here, or better yet, find an even more remote world to call your own. Maybe then you'll be lucky enough to escape Terra's wrath.
No, the reporter shook his head. Those were simply beasts that roamed the same world as the Terrans 80 million years ago. Wars aren't won by tooth and claw anymore.
Kevchak leaned forward once more. Indeed, those pictures were taken with the mirrors set at 80 million light years. These pictures, he swapped to a different folder in the digislate, were taken with the mirrors set at 30 million years ago.
The pictures on the slate now depicted animals completely different to the ones showcased before. Fur replaced scales amongst many of them, and in the majority they were smaller than their predecessors, but their behavior was just as brutal. Claws and teeth ripping and tearing, and meat and viscera being pulled out of still screaming prey. As you can see, only 50 million years passed, and the landscape of Terra's biosphere is unrecognizable, yet the violence remains, Kevchak remarked. Such a short time span for such changes, the reporter couldn't help but comment. Most species on Maker's Cradle haven't experienced any significant changes in billions of years of their recorded existence, but those are entirely new species. That's what happens when there's a constant threat of being eaten alive by a predator. A constant threat of starving to death when your prey bests you. Light speed evolution. Go on, shift through the photos yourself. Kevchak handed the slate to the reporter. He obliged, swiping across the hundreds of pictures in the folder. Do you notice anything missing? Kevchak asked as the reporter was flicking through the pictures. The reporter took a moment before replying, though he knew the answer the second the question was asked. No Terrans, he finally said. Not even their most remote ancestors, Kevchak added. Their most primal of ancestors didn't come into existence for another 5 million years. Barely bipedal humanoids with a capacity to create and utilize rudimentary tools. And that's when things start to become interesting for another reason. That's when life on Terra starts to go down the path of true sentience. I wonder, how do you think a sentience trained for millennia on nothing but bloodshed and violence and the howls of the dying would shape up to be? The reporter shuddered at the thought, and as much as he tried to conceal it, it showed. Kevchak broke a faint smile. The intelligence of the Terran species increased. Their brains grew more complex layers, facilitating higher thought, creativity. Not only that of the Terran's ancestors, but across the animal kingdom of Terra. Every animal, every predator, and every prey didn't just evolve to be more lethal, but to be more inventive in its lethality as well. He paused for a moment before directing his voice to the digislate. Open folder, 3,000 light years, he commanded. The corresponding file opened on the device at the reporter's hands. In this file, Terra itself looked unrecognizable. The biosphere had shifted again, with new species once more replacing the old, but now the surface of the planet looked different too. Cities had spread across it, structures covering unending square miles of once virgin land. Images of toxic smoke rising from chimneys that clawed to meet the heavens and engulf them in their pollution. These were the last images we were able to obtain. This is what Terra looked like 3,000 years ago. Terrans had completely dominated their planet at that point. They had mastered the land, the sea, the skies, and they were even attempting to send their first vessels into the void. Yes, 3,000 years ago, the Terrans were struggling to propel crude rockets filled with liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the orbit of their planet, and now they have void fleets that can rival the combined might of the entire Federation. As I said, light speed evolution. The reporter's face darkened even more. In his mind, he damned Kevchak for not having more chairs available. He felt the desperate need to sit down. Kevchak pointed to the corner of his handmade library. Third digislate, on the second shelf from the top, he said. Turn it on. When we were studying Terra with the mirrors set in the 3,000 light years, we made extensive notes, since we could take a look into the most recent imaging of Terra anyone in the Federation has ever seen. This slate contains entire petabytes of relevant information. What I want you to see, however, should be right on the first page. The reporter did as instructed. The first picture on the device was that of a small avian creature, not too dissimilar to those that flew in Terra's skies 30 million years ago. It looked tiny, covered in feathers, and with a small beak for a mouth.
"The Terrans called this a shrike," Krevchak explained to the reporter. "Believe it or not, it's a hunter, a predator. Unlike other predators you saw before, this one didn't merely attack the throat of its prey, or even its soft underbelly. No, it grabbed and impaled the still-living body of its unfortunate victim on the thorns of the trees the shrike resided in, leaving it to squirm in agony until shock and blood loss finally killed it if the shrike was kind enough. Otherwise, the shrike would devour its still-living body."
The reporter's face formed a grimace of disgust as he swept through the photos, seeing the shrike's work for himself.
"Then there were the orcas,"
Krevchak interrupted the reporter's horror, prompting the digislate at his hands to switch to a relevant picture of a killer whale at Krevchak's voice command.
"Perhaps the most intelligent aquatic animal that ever hunted in Terra's oceanic depths. It was one of the few species of old Earth that apparently had developed a concept of fun. Fun for it consisted of nipping at its prey, mutilating it as it tried to get away, toying with its pain. The orcas hunted together, you see, and what's the point of hunting with friends if you can't have fun while doing it? They would toss their mutilated prey between each other like a ball, flicking it in the air, even painting the waters red with its blood."
The digislate at the reporter's hand played a video depicting just that.
"And of course," Krevchak spoke again, "we can't forget about the cats. One of the most adored companion animals of the Terrans. Small, agile murderers, equipped to shed blood without making a single sound. The way they hunt, their speed and grace, it's almost mesmerizing to watch. When it came to the effectiveness of their killing, cats were second only to their masters, having extinguished more than 60 other Terran species in the time we observed them."
At the prompt, the digislate showed videos of cats on the hunt. It showed them ambush their prey, swipe it with razor-sharp claws and injure it, but not to kill it. Cats, too, treated predation as a game. They would swat at their bleeding victims, relishing whenever they attempted to flee, as that only meant they would have another chance to catch them again and repeat the thrill. Fur and teeth matted red with blood, and a pair of slitted irises that could see through perfect darkness. That's what death had looked like for countless prey animals on Terra.
"And they call those beasts companions. I think I've had enough,"
he said, moving towards the table to set the device upon it. Before he could, Krevchak stopped him.
"No, I don't think you have. You still have hope that somehow we can contend with the cruelty that permeates everything that was ever born on that nightmare of a world called Terra,"
he said, looking at the digislate. He uttered one more word.
"Terran."
The reporter fully expected to see Terrans engage in the same brutal, cruel, and disgusting behavior he had seen so many more animals from the home planet engage in. He expected to see them lurk in the shadows, to attack their unsuspecting food source, even to see them play with their victims. What he saw instead was unlike anything he expected, and far, far worse. What was categorized as prey for a Terran, what was capable of providing a challenge for them, was only another Terran.
"Terrans, 3,000 years ago, sometimes hunted other animals for sport, for fun, but those hardly counted as their prey," Krevchak pointed out. "You see, they quickly figured out how to industrialize their food production, how to completely break the bounds of their planet's food chain. They farmed their food, the animals they ate, like we cultivate our crops. It became a sterile and cold process for them. They ate their food animals packaged and refrigerated from the comfort of their dwellings. But their instincts for bloodshed, for conflict, for a true hunt, They were bred into them over a course of millennia, and they could not be extinguished. So they did the only thing their nature compelled them to do. They hunted each other.
The reporter saw picture after picture of war within the same species of sentient. He saw Terrans hunt each other with rocks and spears. He saw them craft metal into sharp-edged swords with unparalleled mastery, only to plunge them in the bodies of each other, to slice each other's limbs off into bloody stumps. He saw entire fields of their science be propelled by the desire to butcher one another. He saw slings evolve to arrows, and arrows evolve to cannons, not for the purpose of procuring food more easily, but for the purpose of blowing each other to a mess of bloody wet pieces. He saw videos of rudimentary atmocraft carrying weapons capable of destruction on a mass scale. He saw Terra's skies turn red and her sun disappear in the mushroom clouds of nuclear weapons they used on each other. Thousands upon thousands, burning in but a single instance by the fury of the split atom. He saw torture, executions, he saw crucifixions, and he saw the burning of heretics in the pyre. He saw mass graves be filled by emaciated bodies and entire forests of impaled Terrans. He saw death and suffering and destruction and butchery, and he saw it inflicted from one Terran to another. He saw a sight he simply could not comprehend.
They only stopped hunting each other when they found a more worthy prey, Krevchak spoke solemnly. They were on top of their food chain, the apex. They conquered and dominated everything that was in their world, until the only thing left to conquer and to dominate was each other. We, the Skildari, were faced with similar differences as the Terrans were. Differences in our early religions, differences in ideologies, economic disputes amidst our clans. Yet we sought to resolve them through peace, because that was what our nature dictated, what we had evolved to seek as a first solution. We had conflicts, sure. We didn't emerge into the galaxy pure from all violence. That's why we have armed forces after all. Why we have developed technology that inspires fear and awe in our enemies. We know of violence and of war, but it is not part of our nature. But the Terrans, for them, that is their only nature. What we call war, they considered a skirmish, sometimes barely more serious than a playground brawl. For millennia, they took out those instincts, that nature, on each other. Their brutality, the nature of their evil, it was contained. Until the Ixatar made the fateful mistake of declaring war on Terra and condemning the entire galaxy to their horror. Because the moment the Terrans knew there was something else to conquer, something else to hunt, they expanded their food chain, and now it includes all of us.
By the time the reporter stumbled out of Kevchak's prefabricated dwelling in a daze from the information he had just been made privy to, the storm had subsided and the clouds had cleared. The scent of wet dirt filled the air around him, and the clear atmo allowed for a crisp view of the stars above, unobstructed by mist or light pollution. In his state, he only made it a few steps before stumbling and vomiting all over the wet soil. The things he had heard about the Imperium of Terra, the rumors, the historic accounts, and the tall tales alike, they were just a fragment of the truth, a quantum of what they had the capacity to do. When he could finally pull himself together enough to look up to the night sky, all he saw was teeth and claws in the void. He saw the hunters amidst the stars. He felt their breath on the back of his neck, their teeth closing in. He saw the Terrans, and the grinning smile of a hunter that has found their next prey.